The warm sun glistened over the grand garden venue as Emma walked down the aisle in a stunning white gown, her beauty dazzling everyone in attendance. Guests whispered praises, impressed by her poise and charm. John stood at the altar, his eyes brimming with emotion as he watched his bride approach. "She's absolutely stunning," an older woman whispered to her companion. "And so lucky to have John. He's such a kind soul," the companion replied. The ceremony was a picture-perfect moment, with heartfelt vows exchanged. John proudly introduced Emma as the love of his life, and the couple began their new journey surrounded by friends and family. The reception was a lavish affair, with guests laughing, dancing, and celebrating the union. Mrs. Margaret, John's mother, sat in a corner, quietly observing the festivities with a soft smile. She admired Emma and silently prayed for her son's happiness. "She's perfect for John," Margaret said to a family friend sitting next to her. "I hope so," the friend replied cautiously. Sometimes charm can be deceiving. Margaret dismissed the comment, focusing instead on her son's happiness. A few months later, life for the newlyweds seemed to settle into routine. However, an unexpected tragedy struck. Margaret's husband passed away after a brief illness. Devastated and alone, Margaret's health began to deteriorate. Her eyesight weakened, and simple tasks became difficult. John decided to bring his mother to live with them. "Emma, my mom needs us right now," he explained one evening after dinner. "She can't manage on her own, and I can't bear the thought of her struggling." Emma forced a smile, though her heart sank at the idea. "Of course, John," she replied sweetly. "She's family, and we'll take good care of her." When Margaret moved in, Emma initially put on a warm front. She helped her unpack and even cooked a welcome dinner. But as the days turned into weeks, Emma's patience began to wear thin. Why does she always need help with everything? Emma grumbled to herself one morning after Margaret asked for assistance finding her glasses. It's like having a child in the house. As John left for work each morning, Emma's demeanor changed. She became cold and impatient with Margaret. The once loving daughter-in-law transformed into a nagging tormentor. One afternoon, Margaret sat at the dining table, struggling to read a recipe from cookbook. Emma walked in and rolled her eyes. "Do you really need to make a fuss over everything?" Emma snapped. "How hard is it to read a recipe?" "I'm sorry, Emma," Margaret said softly. "My eyesight isn't what it used to be." Emma sighed dramatically. "Of course it's not. I have to do everything around here because you can't even take care of yourself." Margaret stayed silent, her face clouded with sadness. She didn't want to cause any trouble for her son, so she endured Emma's harsh words. Cold meals and mockery at mealtime, Emma's passive aggression became even more evident. While John's meals were plated beautifully, Margaret's portions were often cold or hastily thrown together. One evening, Margaret sat at the table with her plate of lukewarm food while John was still at work. "Thank you, Emma," she said quietly, not wanting to complain. Emma smirked. "Well, it's not like you're cooking anything yourself, is it?" Margaret lowered her eyes, trying to focus on her food. She often wondered if her presence in the house was a mistake, but she had no other options. Gossiping and spreading rumors when Emma wasn't belittling Margaret directly, she was venting to her friends. On a phone call one afternoon, she unleashed her frustration. "Honestly, I don't know how much more I can take," Emma complained. "She's always in the way, and it's like having a useless roommate. I swear, sometimes I think she's cursed this house." Her friend on the other end chuckled. "Are you serious? Like witchcraft?" "I wouldn't be surprised," Emma said, her tone dripping with venom. "Ever since she moved in, everything has been going wrong. I think she's bad luck." Margaret overheard snippets of the conversation from the next room. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't say a word. She felt trapped, unwanted, and invisible in her son's home. Small moments of kindness, only when John's around. When John returned home from work, Emma's personality changed dramatically. She became the picture of a loving wife and caring daughter-in-law. One evening, as John walked through the door, Emma greeted him with a big smile. "Honey, you're home. Dinner's almost ready. Mom and I have been having such a lovely day, haven't we, Mom?" she said, turning to Margaret with a sugary sweet expression. Margaret hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Yes, she finally said, forcing a small smile. John beamed. I'm so glad you two are getting along. Emma played the role perfectly, but the moment John left the room, her smile vanished. Don't look at me like that, she hissed at Margaret. Just stay out of my way. The tension in the house continued to grow. Emma's true nature was hidden from John, but Margaret's pain was becoming unbearable. Each day, she prayed for strength to endure and for her son to see the truth. Little did Emma know, her actions were setting the stage for her ultimate downfall. As the weeks went by, Emma's behavior grew worse. Her initial coldness toward Margaret turned into outright cruelty. She no longer bothered to hide her disdain, knowing that Margaret, frail and afraid, would remain silent. John was oblivious to everything, trusting Emma's sweet facade, while Margaret continued to suffer in silence. Emma began to find new ways to torment Margaret. Whenever John left for work, she would lock Margaret in her room for hours, claiming it was for her own safety. She would deprive her of basic comforts, sometimes even refusing to give her meals. Margaret, with her failing eyesight and weakened spirit, endured it all without complaining. One afternoon, Emma stormed into Margaret's room, furious because the laundry hadn't been folded. Margaret, who had been struggling to see the clothes properly, looked up with confusion. I was just about to finish it, Margaret said softly. Oh, save it, Emma snapped. You're useless. You can't even fold a few clothes properly. I'm sorry, Emma. I'm trying my best. Well, your best isn't good enough, Emma yelled. She grabbed the clothes and threw them onto the floor. From now on, just stay in your room and stop getting in my way. Before Margaret could respond, Emma stormed out and slammed the door. A few seconds later, Margaret heard the sound of the key turning in the lock. She realized Emma had locked her inside. Hours passed, and Margaret remained locked in her room, hungry and frightened. She quietly prayed, hoping John would come home soon and release her. But Emma made sure Margaret stayed confined until just before John returned. Every day, Emma's behavior grew more malicious, spreading malicious rumors. As Emma's abuse escalated, so did the rumors she spread about Margaret. She continued to gossip to her friends, painting her mother-in-law as a witch and a troublemaker. One day, Emma was on the phone with her friend Cynthia, venting as usual. Honestly, Cynthia, I don't know what I did to deserve this, Emma said dramatically. I married the love of my life, and now I'm stuck living with his mother, who's probably cursed me. Cursed you? What do you mean? Cynthia asked, intrigued. I'm telling you, ever since she moved in, everything has been going wrong, Emma said. I think she's a witch. Sometimes I catch her muttering things under her breath. Who knows what kind of spell she's casting? Wow, that sounds scary, Cynthia replied. You should be careful. Oh, don't worry, Emma said with a wicked grin. I've got everything under control. Margaret, who had overheard parts of the conversation, sat on her bed, feeling utterly defeated. She had no idea why Emma hated her so much, and she didn't know how much longer she could endure the abuse. One fateful afternoon, Emma's cruelty reached a horrifying climax. It started like any other day. John left for work, kissing Emma on the cheek and promising to be home early. As soon as he left, Emma turned to Margaret with a sneer. Don't think you're getting off easy today, she said coldly. I'm tired of having you in my house, ruining everything. I haven't done anything wrong, Emma, Margaret said quietly. Oh, please, Emma scoffed. You've been bringing bad luck ever since you got here. I'm going to put an end to it once and for all. Before Margaret could ask what she meant, Emma grabbed her by the arm and dragged her toward the storage room. Margaret protested, but Emma was much stronger. Emma, please, let me go, Margaret pleaded. Shut up, Emma snapped. She opened a large, old suitcase that had been sitting in the corner of the storage room. If you're really a witch, let's see if you can escape from this. Margaret's eyes widened in fear. Emma, no, please. But Emma was relentless. She forced Margaret into the suitcase, ignoring her cries and protests. Once Margaret was inside, Emma zipped it shut and dragged the suitcase to the garage. There, Emma said, panting slightly. Let's see how you like spending a few hours in there. Margaret's muffled cries could be heard from inside the suitcase, but Emma ignored them. She left the suitcase in the corner of the garage and walked back inside the house, feeling triumphant. What Emma didn't realize was that her neighbor, Daniel, had been recording a vlog outside his house at that exact moment. Daniel was an aspiring YouTuber who often filmed videos about life in Lagos. As he adjusted his camera, he heard strange noises coming from Emma and John's garage. Curious, Daniel walked closer and peeked through the window. What he saw left him stunned. He watched as Emma dragged a suitcase into the garage, yelling something about witches. He could hear faint cries coming from inside the suitcase. "Is someone in there?" Daniel whispered to himself, horrified. He quickly grabbed his phone and started recording. As Emma walked back inside, Daniel continued filming. He captured everything: the suitcase, the muffled cries, and Emma's triumphant smirk. "This is insane," Daniel muttered. "I have to show this to John." Daniel waited until John came home that evening. The sun was setting as John parked his car in the driveway, eager to get inside and spend some time with his wife and mother. He had left work a little earlier than usual, hoping to catch them both before dinner. Little did he know, the peaceful home he thought he was walking into was about to erupt with chaos. Emma heard the sound of the car pulling up and quickly switched to her loving wife persona. She glanced at her reflection in the mirror, fixing her hair and forcing a sweet smile onto her face. "John's home, Margaret," Emma said, her voice dripping with fake cheerfulness. "Try not to embarrass me tonight, okay?" Margaret, sitting quietly in the living room, didn't respond. She had long since stopped reacting to Emma's barbs. She simply stared down at her hands, waiting for John's arrival like a lifeline. John walked in and was greeted by Emma, who rushed up to him and kissed him on the cheek. "Welcome home, darling," she said brightly. "How was your day?" "It was fine," John said, smiling back. "How are you, Mom?" he asked, looking over at Margaret. Margaret smiled weakly. "I'm fine, John. How was work?" "Busy as always," John said, taking off his jacket. But before he could say anything else, there was a knock at the door. "I'll get it," Emma said quickly, but John was already on his way to the door. He opened it to find Daniel, his neighbor, standing there with a serious expression on his face. "Hey, Daniel," John said, surprised. "Everything okay? Can I talk to you for a minute?" Daniel asked. His tone was urgent. "Sure," John said, stepping outside. Emma watched nervously from the doorway, her smile faltering. Daniel took a deep breath. "John, I wasn't sure whether to tell you this, but after what I saw today, I felt like I had no choice." "What do you mean?" John asked, confused. Daniel glanced at Emma, who was hovering near the door, then lowered his voice. "It's about your mom and Emma." John frowned. "What about them?" Daniel pulled out his phone and handed it to John. "Just watch." John took the phone and hit play. His eyes widened as he watched the video. He saw Emma dragging the suitcase into the garage, heard the muffled cries, and watched her smirk as she left Margaret locked inside. By the time the video ended, John's face was pale and his hands were trembling. "Is this real?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid so," Daniel said. "I saw it happen. I thought you needed to know." John swallowed hard, trying to process what he had just seen. He turned to Emma, who was standing in the doorway, looking panicked. "Emma," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "We need to talk." Emma forced a laugh, trying to act confused. "What's going on, John? What did Daniel show you?" "Don't play dumb," John said, stepping inside the house. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that Emma had never heard before. "I saw the video, Emma. I saw what you did." Emma's eyes darted around nervously. "Video? I don't know what you're talking about." "Stop lying," John shouted, his voice booming through the house. "I saw you lock my mother in a suitcase and drag her into the garage. How could you do that? What kind of person does something like that?" Emma's face turned pale. "John, it's not what it looks like," she stammered. It was a joke. A harmless joke. A joke," John repeated, his eyes blazing with fury. "You think locking my mother in a suitcase is funny? Do you know how terrified she must have been?" Margaret, who had been sitting silently on the couch, began to cry softly. John turned to her, his anger replaced by concern. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked gently. Margaret wiped her tears and nodded. I'm fine, John. No, you're not, John said, sitting down next to her. Tell me the truth, Mom. What's been going on here? Margaret hesitated, glancing at Emma, who was standing frozen by the door. Don't be afraid, Mom, John said softly. I need to know the truth. Margaret took a deep breath, and for the first time, she began to open up. John, I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want to cause problems in your marriage, she said quietly. But Emma, she hasn't been kind to me. She locks me in my room. She calls me names, and she says I'm a burden. John's heart broke as he listened to his mother's words. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't want to make things worse, Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. I thought I could handle it. But it's been so hard, John. John turned to Emma, his jaw clenched with rage. How could you do this? How could you treat my mother like this? Emma burst into tears, trying to play the victim. I'm sorry, John. I didn't mean to hurt her. I was stressed, and I didn't know how to handle it. Stressed, John repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. That's your excuse? You tormented my mother because you were stressed. I love you, John. Emma sobbed. Please, don't let this ruin our marriage. John stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. You don't know the meaning of love, he said quietly. If you did, you would have treated my mother with kindness and respect. But instead, you chose to hurt her. And I can't forgive that. Emma's face crumpled. John, please. It's over, Emma, John said firmly. Pack your things and leave. As Emma stood there, sobbing and pleading, John turned back to his mother and took her hand. I'm so sorry, Mom, he said, his voice breaking. I should have seen what was happening. I should have protected you. It's not your fault, John, Margaret said gently. You trusted her, and you wanted to believe the best in her. That's not a bad thing. But I let you suffer, John said, his eyes filled with guilt. I'll never let that happen again. Margaret squeezed his hand. We'll be okay, John. We have each other, and that's what matters. As they sat together, comforting each other, Emma realized that she had lost everything. She had destroyed her marriage, betrayed the man who loved her, and exposed her true nature to the world. And there was no one to blame but herself. The truth about Emma's wickedness spread quickly through the neighborhood. Lagos was a city where news traveled fast, and in just a few hours, everyone knew about the woman who had locked her elderly mother-in-law in a suitcase. It wasn't just a rumor either. Daniel had shared the video evidence with a few trusted neighbors, and soon, Emma's cruelty was the topic of every conversation. The next morning, as Emma tried to leave the house to go to the market, she noticed something unusual. People were staring at her, whispering as she walked past. She could hear snippets of their conversations. Isn't that the woman who locked her mother-in-law in a suitcase? Yes, that's her. Can you believe it? So wicked. I used to think she was so beautiful and kind. I guess beauty really is only skin deep. Emma's face burned with shame as she hurried past them, pretending not to hear. But no matter where she went, the whispers followed her. Even her closest friends, like Cynthia, had turned their backs on her. Cynthia, wait, Emma called out when she saw her friend at the corner store. Cynthia turned around, her expression cold. What do you want, Emma? I just wanted to explain, Emma said, trying to sound apologetic. There's nothing to explain, Cynthia said, crossing her arms. I saw the video, Emma. Everyone did. How could you do something so horrible? It's not what it looks like, Emma lied. I wasn't thinking clearly. Cynthia shook her head. Save it, Emma. I don't want to be friends with someone like you. You're a disgrace. Emma opened her mouth to respond, but Cynthia had already walked away, leaving her standing alone in the street. For the first time in her life, Emma felt the sting of public humiliation. She had always prided herself on being admired and respected, but now she was nothing more than a pariah. When Emma returned home that afternoon, she found John waiting for her in the living room. His face was serious, and Margaret sat beside him, looking sad but relieved. Sit down, Emma, John said, his voice calm but firm. Emma hesitated but obeyed, sitting down on the edge of the couch. We need to talk, John said. I've made a decision. Emma's heart began to race. John, please. Let me finish, John interrupted. After everything that's happened, after everything you've done to my mother, I can't stay married to you anymore. I've already spoken to a lawyer. We're getting a divorce. Emma gasped, her eyes filling with tears. John, no. You can't do this. I can, and I am, John said firmly. You've destroyed any trust or love I had for you. You betrayed me, and you hurt my mother. There's no coming back from that. Emma felt her knees, sobbing. Please, John, I'll change. I'll be better, I promise. It's too late for that, Emma, John said, his voice cold. Pack your things and leave. But where will I go? Emma cried. I have nowhere to stay. That's not my problem, John said, standing up. You made your bed, Emma. Now you have to lie in it. As Emma packed her bags, the skies outside darkened, and a torrential rainstorm began. It felt as though even the heavens were weeping for her downfall. By the time Emma was ready to leave, the rain was pouring down in sheets. John stood by the door, watching as Emma dragged her suitcase to the front porch. Goodbye, Emma, he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. I hope you learn from this. Emma looked at him, hoping for a last-minute change of heart, but John's expression remained cold. As Emma stepped out into the rain, she saw that several neighbors had gathered outside, watching the scene unfold. Some of them whispered to each other, while others openly stared. Look, she's finally leaving, one woman said. Good riddance, another added. She doesn't deserve to stay in that house. Emma tried to keep her head high, but the weight of their judgment was too much to bear. She hurried down the street, her clothes quickly soaking through. She didn't know where she was going, and she didn't care. All she knew was that her life had fallen apart, and there was no one left to help her. Inside the house, Margaret watched through the window as Emma disappeared into the rain. She felt a mix of emotions, relief that the nightmare was finally over, and sadness that had come to this. John put a comforting hand on her shoulder. Are you okay, Mom? Margaret nodded. I am now, John. Thank you for standing up for me. I should have done it sooner, John said, his voice full of regret. You did it when it mattered, Margaret said with a gentle smile. And that's what counts. As mother and son sat together, the house felt peaceful for the first time in months. The storm outside raged on, but inside they knew they had weathered the worst of it and come out stronger on the other side. The days after Emma's departure were quiet, almost eerily so. For months, Margaret had lived under the constant tension of Emma's abuse, and the sudden peace in the house felt surreal. But as time passed, that peace began to feel like a blessing. Slowly but surely, Margaret started to regain her strength, both physically and emotionally. John, deeply remorseful for not noticing the abuse sooner, became more attentive to his mother's needs. He rearranged his work schedule so he could spend more time at home, and he hired a kind, elderly woman named Mama Grace to help care for Margaret when he was away. Good morning, Mama, John greeted one day as he helped his mother out of bed. Good morning, my son, Margaret said, smiling softly. You're up early today. I wanted to make you breakfast, John said. How about pancakes and tea? Margaret chuckled. You've been spoiling me lately. You deserve it, Mom, John said, his tone serious. After everything you went through, I just want to make sure you're happy and comfortable. Margaret reached out and gently touched his hand. You've done more than enough, John. I'm proud of the man you've become. John smiled, but there was still a hint of sadness in his eyes. I wish I had seen the truth about Emma sooner. Don't blame yourself, son, Margaret said. Sometimes love blinds us to the flaws in people. What matters is that you stood up for me when it counted. Meanwhile, Emma's life had taken a drastic turn for the worse. With no home, no friends, and no money, she found herself wandering the streets of Lagos, searching for shelter. The rainstorm on the night she was thrown out had soaked her to the bone, and now, days later, she was battling a severe cold. Emma had always been proud, but now she was forced to beg for food and shelter. One day, as she sat on a bench in a crowded market, she overheard two women talking about her. Did you hear about that woman, Emma? The one who tormented her mother-in-law. Yes, I heard. She used to be so admired, and now look at her. Karma, I tell you. Emma felt tears sting her eyes. She wanted to shout at them, to defend herself, but deep down, she knew they were right. She had brought this misery upon herself. One evening, as Emma sat alone in a rundown shelter, she thought about everything that had happened. She remembered the way John used to look at her with love and admiration, and the way Margaret had tried to be kind to her, even when Emma didn't deserve it. "I ruined everything," Emma whispered to herself, tears streaming down her face. "I had a family, a home, and I threw it all away." For the first time in her life, Emma felt true remorse. She realized that her actions had hurt not only Margaret, but also John, and ultimately herself. Back at John's house, life continued to improve. Margaret was now able to walk around the house with ease, and her eyesight, though still weak, was slowly improving with treatment. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset, Margaret decided it was time to share a valuable lesson with her son. "John," she said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Yes, Mom. There's something I want you to remember," Margaret said, her tone gentle but firm. "Life will always test us. Sometimes people will hurt us, and sometimes we'll make mistakes. But no matter what happens, we must never lose sight of what truly matters: kindness, respect, and family." John nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, Mom. I've learned that the hard way." Margaret smiled. "You've learned, and that's what matters. And someday, when you find love again, remember to choose someone who shares those same values." John chuckled. "I'll keep that in mind. No more Emmas." They both laughed, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like everything was going to be okay. Though Emma's future remained uncertain, one thing was clear. She had been given a harsh lesson in humility. Whether she would change for the better was a question only time could answer. But for now, justice had been served, and the balance had been restored. As Margaret and John sat together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, they knew that they had weathered the storm, and that brighter days lay ahead.